It's hard to think of a more feared and legendary figure in hip-hop than Suge Knight. Not only did Suge build out one of the most iconic record labels in history, but he absolutely terrorized the entire music industry and ran an empire through fear, violence, and intimidation. Many of the most legendary West Coast rappers in history, from Dre to Tupac to Snoop Dogg, had their stories deeply twisted with Suge's. Suge was born in 1965 as Marion Knight and grew up in Compton, California. Pretty much everyone who knew Suge in the early days says he came from a really tight-knit, loving, and close family. While Compton might have a mainstream reputation of being dangerous nowadays, you gotta remember it was originally a middle-class suburb. This began to change through white flight that happened through the 50s and 60s, which meant Suge's family probably watched their city undergo a huge change. Suge found a lot of success as an athlete and was really excited about football. After he graduated high school, Suge went to UNLV in Vegas where he started playing for the Rebels. His former coach called Suge an ideal player, quote, "the type of player any college football coach would love to have on his team." Suge was voted Rookie of the Year and excelled on the field, but unfortunately his darker side would come out from time to time. Suge bragged about reaching into a QB's helmet and ripping his skin off. He also reportedly hustled the school by claiming to lose his books and turning around and selling them for cash. Suge had his own apartment, and there were rumors that he had side hustles to get him by. Suge dropped out of UNLV and actually ended up playing for the Rams for a little bit. It was a weird time for the NFL. That also made Suge public enemy number one. He got pelted with eggs and didn't get much of a chance to prove himself. After playing only 2 games, Suge was out on his own again. This time though, he decided to leave football behind and attack the music business with everything he had. Suge entered music in an unconventional way by getting hired as a bodyguard for Bobby Brown. He used his job to shake hands with a lot of artists who he'd later end up working with or trying to kill. This is how Suge met everyone from Dr. Dre to Eazy-E to Ice Cube. It's also how Suge built a reputation as the one dude in music who would do the crazy shit no one else would even dream of. Suge began to manage a young singer who went by the name Chocolate. Chocolate knew Vanilla Ice back from when they worked together at a club in Texas and had written some songs on his new album as well. While Vanilla Ice may be considered a one-hit wonder, conversation for another day, you gotta remember he sold millions of albums back in the day, and Chocolate never got paid for his contributions to the album. And Suge decided to get paid by any means necessary. So he ambushed Vanilla Ice in his hotel room and negotiated a payout for his artist. Legend has it that Suge did this by hanging Vanilla Ice upside down by the ankles off the hotel balcony until he agreed to pay. And when it came time for him to make his next big move, he would use the same kind of brute force tactics with anyone who stood in his way. In the early 90s, NWA was easily the biggest rap group in the world. Before they took over the game, hip-hop's center of gravity was always out on the East Coast. But once Straight Outta Compton dropped, it established the West Coast as rap's new powerhouse. Problem was, there was a ton of internal fighting in the group because of money. Eazy-E was in tight with a businessman named Jerry Heller, who was managing the group. Meanwhile, Dr. Dre and Ice Cube were frozen out of the relationship and were not seeing the type of payday they deserved. The group started to fall apart and Dre was looking for a new way forward, but he first had to find a way out of his contract with Jerry. And that's where he turned to Suge Knight, the only person that could get it done. According to Jerry, Suge confronted both Eazy and him at the studio and threatened them with a gang of hitmen who were holding pipes and bats. They were forced to release Dre from his contract, clearing the way for him and Suge to start Death Row. Almost immediately, Death Row became one of the most important record labels in hip-hop. When Dre put out The Chronic, it went triple platinum and spearheaded a whole new G-Funk sound that would pretty much define the West Coast for years. A year later, Dre's prodigy Snoop Dogg would drop Doggy Style, which was an even bigger hit, going quadruple platinum and turning Snoop into an instant superstar. In 1992, Suge was arrested by forcing 2 up-and-coming rappers on their knees at gunpoint, pistol whipping one of them and shooting near the other. Plus, Death Row Records was notorious for being Mob Piru affiliated. Suge had cultivated heavy ties with the Bloods and often had gang members at label offices. Death Row was also implicated in the murder of a Rollin' 60s Crip at a private party. An argument broke out that resulted in a mob of Bloods stomping out Kelly Anderson to death while Suge looked on and encouraged them. Suge was never charged in Kelly Anderson's murder, but the situation definitely amped up the kind of street tensions that would ultimately result in Tupac's death just a year later. Suge's violent behavior got so out of control that Dre felt it was fucking up his ability to make music productively. It was during this time that Tupac was locked up in prison for a sex abuse case. Suge offered to post $1 million+ for bail for Pac if he agreed to sign to Death Row Records. Pac jumped at the offer and instantly became one of Suge's most loyal foot soldiers. When Dre left the crew, Pac started openly dissing him while riding hard for Suge and Death Row. Suge got involved in Pac's beef with Biggie Smalls and Puff Daddy's Bad Boy Records, escalating the East Coast-West Coast feud to a fever pitch. One night in Vegas, Pac stomped out a Crip named Orlando Baby Lane Anderson while out with Suge. After attending a Tyson fight, Pac hopped in Suge's BMW. 3 hours later, Anderson pulled up and fired shots. Suge was shot in the head and Pac was killed. In the aftermath of Pac's murder, Death Row Records began to unravel. After that, Suge was sentenced to 9 years in prison, which forced Snoop to finally jump ship and sign with No Limit Records in New Orleans. But one thing's for sure, Suge was not about to give it up. Suge actually signed a whole new roster of artists while in prison, but when he got released, he was way more invested in his mafia mentality than anything else. Suge went full tilt into living it up. Between lavish parties and a media tour meant to promote Death Row's next generation, he was doing all he could to assert himself as the rightful king of the West Coast. Suge had such a grudge against his rivals that he commissioned a painting in Death Row's office lobby that showed Dr. Dre being sodomized and Diddy watching while wearing a ballet outfit. At the 2004 Vibe Awards, Suge paid someone to punch Dr. Dre while he was there to receive a Lifetime Achievement Award. Dre got smacked, but the dude Suge hired was stabbed by Young Buck, a national artist who was signed to 50 Cent, who in turn clicked up with Dr. Dre and Eminem. One of his new artists at the time, Crooked L, claims that things at Death Row Records were so savage that they were seen as more of a gang than a record label. Suge was very tied in with the Bloods, and Crooked talked about having to purchase an arsenal of guns and rock a bulletproof vest just to maneuver with the team. Suge even appeared on Jimmy Kimmel's show to imply he had Eazy-E assassinated with an HIV-infected needle. Eazy-E's son is on record claiming he believes that Suge is responsible for his father's death, and Suge pretty much made a TV appearance to confirm it. While at a party thrown by Kanye in Miami, Suge was shot in the leg by a gunman hired by Jimmy Henchman, a rival kingpin who dropped 10 racks to send a message. Henchman was managing the game, another Compton rapper with ties to Dr. Dre, and Suge's interference pushed Henchman to intervene. Snoop even started beefing openly about his former label boss and dropped a diss track called Pimp Slapped. Yet another sign that Suge was a walking target. By 2006, Suge filed for bankruptcy, burying Death Row Records and claiming he owed over $100 million of debt. In the next few years, Suge went completely off the rails. Cops arrested him for punching a naked woman, and he was brought up on drug possession charges as well. Suge was also punched out by Akon's business manager and knocked out cold inside a club in LA. When he showed up to Chris Brown's album release party in LA, Suge got shot 6 times. He miraculously survived and had surgery, but the physical effects of taking all those bullets had major impacts on his health. With so many financial and legal troubles, Suge was pissed when he heard Dre and Ice Cube were producing Straight Outta Compton, a biopic about NWA. He was even angrier when he heard he would be featured in the movie as a character. Demanding answers, he showed up to the set of the movie in a blood-red truck, ready for war. A close friend of Suge's named Terry Carter ended up intervening and trying to get Suge to calm down. He suggested that Suge meet at a local burger spot so they could talk and mediate the situation. At the same time, Clay Sloan, also known as Bone, a former gang member who was working the movie and had a confrontation with Suge on the set, popped up to confront Suge. A fight broke out and Suge drove his truck, running over both of them. He injured Bone but killed his own friend Terry Carter, a really well-respected dude who had set the meeting to try and get Suge to cool off. Suge turned himself in to the police and was eventually sentenced to 28 years in prison. With Suge facing dire health problems in the aftermath of his shooting, he said it's very likely he'll die while incarcerated. Death Row Records still lives on though. Snoop recently announced that he controls the label now and has plans going forward to revitalize the brand. Suge has been considered the boogeyman of hip-hop, and his reign led to a ton of bodies throughout California. It's hard to think of anyone else who has fallen so far after being feared for so long.